This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything. I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony, air quotes nippy, Ames.
And this is A Little Bit Culty, a podcast about what happens when things that seem like a great thing at first go bad.
Every week, we chat with survivors, experts, and whistleblowers for real cult stories told directly by the people who lived through them.
Because we want you to learn a few things we've had to learn the hard way.
Like, if you think you're too smart to get sucked into something culty, you're already prime recruitment material.
You might even already be in a cult.
Oops. You better keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Season 6 of A Little Bit Culty. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of A Little Bit Culty. Just Sarah here. Nippy is down for the count with some kind of mini plague. So guess what? I'm doing this intro solo. Hand solo. But it's good because we wanted to skip the banter and get right to the meat of this juicy two-part episode. It's about something I think about a lot: breaking toxic cycles. Our guest today, licensed mental health counselor Jaime Mahler, is a powerhouse who you may know from her handle, Recollected Self, on social media. Her therapeutic perspective on trauma and toxic relationships has collected millions of views across TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And she's worked with other social media influencers to create and improve the content out there around mental health. Jaime's new book is called Toxic Relationship Recovery: Your Guide to Identifying Toxic Partners, Leaving Unhealthy Dynamics, and Healing Emotional Wounds After a Breakup. In stores now, the book aims to help readers spot red flags in relationships, as well as reestablish relationships with themselves after getting rid of toxic partners. If you're more of a podcast person, which, you might be since you're listening to this one, you can also check out Jaime's show, Unlearned. We are excited to sit down with her and get into it. Here's our chat with Jaime Mahler. Welcome to A Little Bit Culty, Jaime.
Yay!
And congratulations. I believe that yesterday was your pub date.
Yes, yesterday.
Look at that book.
Yesterday was my publication day.
Can I get a what dog?
This is the real one. That's the reader's advanced one.
Yes, we have two versions out in the world, and one is riddled with typos.
Some of us are advanced, Sarah.
No, this is the advanced one.
Oh. Well,
and just to pump your tires, I'm going to read what I wrote about this, which is in the insert of the book, just to welcome everybody. This says, and there's lots of great endorsements. I'm just going to read mine. Both practical and powerful, this book is the definitive guide for understanding and healing from toxic relationships. Jaime puts names on things that most of us experience, yet many of us don't talk about, but now we can.
Yes, I love that endorsement. It made my day. And that's why it was like a big feature. If you guys actually, I think if you have the final one, that it should be on the back one. So the advance, I think, has it inside, and then the back. Yeah, did you see it?
I didn't see that. No, I didn't see that. Whoa.
Did you read the book cover to cover, Sarah?
I was listening to it
it's
cover
on
to
the
cover.
back cover. So you got featured.
Okay.
How did I miss that?
I don't know, but
That's so cool.
it was just the back cover that was updated that nobody got told that we updated it. So that's probably why.
I do want to focus largely on the book, but of course people want to know, who are you? What was your culty experience?
Yeah, I mean, the culty experience, this is what's so funny about using the word culty, is I actually love that you're starting to coin it more because, and obviously with this podcast, because it's hard to explain to people when you describe something like a religious experience that would be considered mainstream. So to give everybody clarity, I was raised Catholic, and most people think oh, Catholicism, par for the course. Like, we've all been to church or a funeral or whatever. We kind of understand what that is. And to describe Catholicism as a cult is a little extreme, or they kind of put you aside and they kind of scoff at you and they're like, okay, there's like a billion people that are Catholic. Clearly it's not a cult. And what I like to describe to people is, and I know you guys know this very well, it does remind me of similar, like how the infrastructure of what you guys went through, where there was this known entity that was exposed to the world, right? There was the trainings and the lay people that just, they just, learned from Keith and then went about their way, right? It was like a tiered system. Well,
Yes.
what I went through was very similar, where we have that very outward aesthetic understanding of what Catholicism is, right? We're like, okay, we all get it. We, the priest and bow and up and down. But then we get very, very layered and deeper. And what happens when you go deeper is very, very scary psychological things. And that's how I would describe how I ended up in a variation of like a culty version of Catholicism. And my story really started in childhood because my family was raised Catholic, and it wasn't militant. It wasn't, what we're seeing on the news right now with people who are in, extremism versions of it. It wasn't like my family, locked me up or did anything extreme like that. What I would say, though, is there was a lot of what people call like the Catholic guilt. There was a lot of shame. There was a lot of judgment. There was a lot of almost those emotional threads or emotional weights to how I was supposed to perceive myself and how I was supposed to perceive whether like I was good or bad or sinful or holy or pious or whatever. So that was kind of laying the groundwork, right? It laid the groundwork of, I knew that this was an important thing to my family and that this was how I quote unquote reached salvation, all of that stuff. And that was all throughout my childhood. So my family, they were devout. We would go to, weekly mass. We would be doing what some people, I don't know, most people know what the rosary is. We would do the rosary. My dad would fast. Fasting was huge. My dad was ardent faster. He would fast a lot. There was some of the conspiracy theories, and this gets very more deep. So if anyone's Catholic, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. But there was, the apparitions, which are like Marian apparitions, like Mary, the Virgin Mary. And that was part of my dad's conversion story. So that was talked about, and Marian apparitions are basically, just for the person who's not in Catholicism, it's a instance where the church recognizes that Mary visited and people saw her. Like she visited someone, a child, a human, whatever, and they recognize it. So there's, apparitions that are approved and not approved, and there's this whole process. But that was a huge part of my dad's story. So I was already in a deeper part of it, because there's people that are like, yeah, I understand that's part of my faith, but I don't want to go there. It's a little extreme. Let them do their thing, but I'll just go to church and let it be what it is. So clearly I was already like set up. My dad passed when I was 8. That was a whole like shaking of the infrastructure of my life, obviously. And he passed suddenly. He passed from a heart attack. And that clearly also had something to do with, my faith and wanting to believe that he was in heaven and wanting to believe that, this was all for a purpose and everything means something, right? Okay, so fast forward to when I was getting a little bit older, 13, 14, 15, right at the age of, realization, the age of reason. And I started going to these camps in the summer, and I didn't look at them as part of the culty version of Catholicism until much later in my life. But this was very much the laying of the groundwork for how it got very, very intense, very fast. So once a year, we would go to these camps. And they were very vibrant and enthusiastic. There was a lot of music. There was a lot of talking about God, Jesus, the Eucharist, which is, the Catholicism version of like God incarnate. And so it was very, very like culture immersion in the faith system. And there was a part of me that was like, no, I really want to, like, I was a very all or nothing child. I was like, I'm either all in or all out. And most people who knew me in high school were like, no, Jamie, you were always like this. You were like all in or all out. And so it came to this point when I was, getting to my late teenage years, and I was like, I'm all in. I'm so all in. Like, I'm not going to half-ass my faith. I'm not going to kind of do my faith. I'm going to fully immerse myself into the faith. And that was like, the dream statement of the school that I ended up going to, because the school in Ohio that's very rigid and very conservative and ended up evolving into this kind of cult-like experience was hosting these camps. They would host the camps every year in the summer. They would do them all summer long, and there would be thousands of children and, teenagers. Well, I should say teenagers. They were all probably 13 and above. There were thousands of teenagers that would come in, and we would all learn about the faith, and they'd all get us on fire. And then, of course, there'd be a promotion at the end. They're like, if you want to take it seriously and you're of age, like, you can go to this school. And so we constantly heard about that school for like 5-6 years. And I would go every single year, like, not even a joke, like religiously. I would like tell myself, no, I'm going. And once I got to the age where I realized, okay, I can kind of make this mine. Like, I can make this mine. I can go all in, right? I was going to a school in upstate Cortland, New York. I was going to SUNY Cortland, and I transferred to this school. And this is good for context. I was in probably one of the most severe depressive states in my entire life. This is great for context because I try to tell people, like, this is where I was. I was chain smoking. I was 18. I was chain smoking. I was making very like careless decisions, like sexually and stuff like that. I was devastated. I was depressed, and I was very, very physically sick. When I was 18, I got very physically sick. That was a par for the course. I kept getting sick, like physically. And I don't know how to explain it. People are like, well, what was it? I'm like, I just had a terrible immune system, and I couldn't fight off like basic infections. So I remember getting like taken to the hospital and being like, what's going on? And I was just like, my life's falling apart. And I know that God is found in this moment. When I was at these camps, I felt like I was near God. And I remember this moment where I was like, I was in the pits of what I considered hell. And I was like, I'm all in. I'm going to this school. So the reason why this is important for you all to understand is that I have OCD, and I have struggled with OCD to this day. And OCD likes to lie to us. And it basically says, we're going to do things all or nothing. It's either fully clean or everything's unclean. It's either you're sinful or you're holy. It's like, there's no in between, right? And so what ended up happening is my OCD got really, really bad. And I was very kind of neurotic that summer, where I was working 60-hour weeks. I was prepping to go to this school. So I knew I had to become holier and holier. I was like almost neurotically praying, right? So if I wasn't working, I was praying, right? So I was very sick, right? Like, I try to tell people this, like, I was very, very sick. I was basically like in a little mind prison where if I wasn't working, I had to be praying, because that was how I was going to get holy enough to get to this school. So then I get to this school. And the reason why this got really bad really fast is that it was basically a school almost filled. I shouldn't say every single person that went to school was like me, but the majority of people had that same mentality where they were like all in. You have to pray as much as you can. You have to fast as much, and it was a lot of like, ignore your basic needs, ignore your basic, and what ended up happening is the school had an infrastructure. This is why anyone who's listening who's gone to the school know what I'm talking about. We had something similar to like sororities and fraternities, but we didn't call them sororities and fraternities. We called them households. And this is where it gets more intense, right? So we were inducted. We had to sign a covenant, and people are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, no, these were real things I had to do. I had to sign a covenant. I had to do like rituals that I joined the household. So I vividly remember this. We had to do like these series of prayers, and we had to sign our name to this document. And we had to say that, we are bound forever for these institutions that we, laid out for ourselves. And one of the institutions of my household was, and I'm going to try to not name names because I just want to keep the distance from it, but my household was all about spiritual warfare. So enter clearly that caused a lot of problems for my healing, primarily because when I went to deconstruct how intense this got, my immediate thought was clearly I'm getting possessed by demons. I'm being serious. Like I was so convinced that demons were like entering into my space that I didn't know where to turn, right? I was so terrified. And that was definitely from my time in that school and also in that household, which is for people who are, confused, just consider it like a sorority.
Was that because you started to doubt? And whenever you start to doubt, the demons are creeping in? Those are kind of one and the same?
Yeah. So Nibby, like this is a great example. So what would happen when we were in household? So picture it. This is why I say picture like a sorority. We would meet 5 times a week. I wish I could make this stuff up. Like this is every single day of the week. We had something that was expected of us. And many of those things were like, quote unquote, optional. But because, groupthink, it was very like, you guys probably remember this stuff. Like you don't have to come, but everyone's there. And like, if you're not there, like you're failing us.
Right.
And that was a very like groupthink kind of thing. There was a couple of mandatory things. I can't remember. I think it was rosary and mass. So these like higher, like this is a hierarchy of like piety basically. And then we would have like group prayer. We'd have business meeting. Like it was literally almost every single day. I'm not joking you. So we were held accountable almost every single day while we were on campus. And we were held to a very high standard of piety every single day that we were on campus. And if we weren't going to an event, we either had to kind of have a rationale for it, or, I mean, it wasn't like they were hunting us down. This was all a lot of like psychological constraint, but it was very like, you want to be holy? Why aren't you at this?
Right.
You keep telling us that you're struggling with this sin. Why aren't you here? Right? We don't know how to help you if you're not doing this. Right?
It's coercion.
Oh yeah, 100. Like that coercion, control, the manipulation of the mind. Like, so when you talk about the demons thing, this. Oh my gosh, if I can talk about how damaging this was, it was just picture a bunch of women. Because by the way, they were gendered. Like you couldn't have mixed gendered, so everyone was either like in a woman household or a male household. There wasn't mixed gendered households. Okay, so all the women were in the room. And we'd be talking, right? And there would be a lot of quote unquote accountability. But think about like, we would be sharing our souls. We would be talking about like, quote unquote, our sins, our traumas, a lot of trauma exposure. And for untrained people, I wasn't a therapist at this point. Like I was exposed to trauma all the time. Like they were talking to me about like their sexual abuse and like their sexual sins and like things that made them think they were going to hell. And there was just so much trauma talk. And so we're all sitting around, think of like 30 to 40 women sitting around talking about this, which is in theory, it sounds really beautiful, like from the outside looking in, but it was very controlling because what ended up happening was we would be talking about our problems and what their rationale would be was, okay, well, have you been praying enough? And we'd be like, yes, well, I'm praying every day. I'm praying all the time. Like I'm trying so hard to like get beyond this sin or get beyond this trauma, right? And then my household would be known for saying, well, do we need to consider like if there's an oppression? Like, is there a spiritual warfare aspect of this? And so immediately when I would be struggling with something, my brain would go, am I getting spiritually attacked right now? And so fast forward, I don't want to spend forever on this, but fast forward to when I was an adult. So when you're an adult, they have like continuing, we had Facebook groups. Like once you were out of the school, it would be like you could stay in contact with your quote unquote household / sorority, whatever. Right. And I never will forget this.
/ prison.
Yeah, for sure. 9 prison. Right. And they're, you know what? They're always going to tell you this. They're gonna be like, you could have left. You didn't have to go. You didn't have to do this. And I'm like, dude, like this is just full mind control at this point.
Of course.
So anyways, fast forward a few years, I was starting to struggle in my faith and I turned to my sisters. By the way, we had to call, like not had to, but everyone had to call each other like sister and brother. Everyone was my sister. And so I called on to my sisters, which are just the people in the household. And I was like, guy, I'm struggling. And it was very, this is like, I'm trying to be succinct. There's like a lot of complex stuff that happens in Catholicism, especially around sexuality. So in Catholicism, you're not allowed to use birth control. One of the biggest things that was very difficult for women that were Catholic, that were real and actually talking about it, was that they didn't have a lot of body autonomy. And I remember struggling with that because, to be fair, I mean, I'm going to be very vulnerable here. We were condemned if we ever tried to control a pregnancy. Like if we had to like use a condom, we were considered mortal sin level. Like that was very bad. Very, very bad to like ever prevent a pregnancy. We could use something called NFP, which for people who are in the more natural minded, it's like fertility awareness. So you could like understand your cycle. But if you were going beyond that, you were considered problematic. You were very much considered like sinful, possibly leaning into mortal sin, which is like the biggest no-no ever, right? So I remember struggling with this, and I was going to my sisters and I was like, listen, this is really hard. Right? Like I'm clearly going through a lot of stuff mentally. I already have kids. Like I think I already had 2 children at this point, and I have 3 kids now. So I was really struggling. And I basically was making the case for how I don't know how I feel about NFP anymore, which is basically the ability to like prevent. I was like, I don't know if I can do this. Like, I was basically asking for help. And then immediately within like hours, there was a post from, I want to say it was either the coordinator, which is basically like the leader of the group. It was either the coordinator or a past coordinator. So I can't remember who it was. It was someone who was like one of our sisters, like spoke out and was like, I'm uncomfortable with the direction of this conversation. I think we need to do a St. Michael chaplet, which for anyone who's Catholic, they understand St. Michael was the angel that one of the like head honcho conquerors of Satan, right? Like you call on him as an advocate to like defeat evil. Okay. Like just think about him. Think about like a warrior for God, right? Mm-hmm. So they literally, I was very vulnerable. I was struggling. I made a post on Facebook, and then within hours, they were like, hey, we're going to start a 9-day novena, which is just a prayer sequence. We're going to start a 9-day novena chaplet to St. Mike because this is clearly a problematic conversation, and I don't like the way this conversation is going. And we need to keep ourselves accountable for how this could clearly cause a problem. And so basically, without telling me and without naming names, because they didn't call me out on the post, they basically were like, Jamie's adding evil to this group, and we have to combat that evil. And so let's collectively pray against what's happening to Jamie, which is clearly a spiritual oppression, because she would never post that if she was holy and if she was like righteous and if she was pious, right? So when I tell you that was one of the breaking moments for me, like I look back and my friend and me call them breadcrumbs. I don't know if you guys use that terminology, but we talk about like, what were the breadcrumbs of like, we were still there. We were still inside of the like, we were still ourselves, but being indoctrinated. We look for the breadcrumbs. And to me, that was a breadcrumb. I immediately was like, what is going on? I'm getting accused of bringing demonic oppression into the presence of this group because I'm struggling with my body autonomy being thwarted. And by the way, this is the most lonely part of this. Nobody's allowed to talk about it because when you talk about it, you get accused of being demonic. So when I was trying to talk about it, they were like, you're evil. Like you're clearly like something got a hold of you. And so that was the biggest heartbreak for me. And I was like, it was one of the moments where I slowly realized, oh my gosh, I'm in so deep. I'm so deep in this. And like, I know we were not wanting to spend tons of time on this, but like this context is pretty important because this is where so much of my story of like where I wrote this book came from, because a lot of the stuff in the beginning of that book, which is a lot of strategies that harmful people use, these are strategies that are used on you.
Yep.
These are strategies that are used on us.
This podcast wouldn't happen without our amazing, supportive, generous patrons. Are you with us? Come find us over on Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty for bonus episodes, exclusive content, and the occasional Zoom with our fan favorites from our past episodes. It's a lot of fun over there, people.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
You've heard from our sponsors. Now let's get back to a little bit culty, shall we?
The theme of our podcast is the abuses of power that go on in cults or organizations aren't proprietary to cults. They're everywhere. So you just illustrated how coercion, shame, all those things, there's no recourse for you, it didn't sound like, except for being obedient. You were actually going with an actual grievance, and that's how it was met.
Yes, it was a lot.
Nothing shocks us.
It's typical. It isn't anything we haven't heard before, and it isn't anything that, but your book articulates it and encapsulates it very well. So thank you for sharing.
Was that the final wake up, Jamie? Or is there more that happened before you got out?
I think it was untangling a lot of the doctrine around faith and allegiance and the institution of God in that faith system, right? So when people are like, okay, well, what do you believe now? Like, I'm not even going to go into that right now, but it's this understanding of when you get told that the faith that you're in is the one true faith, and it is the source and summit of all humanity. I'm not kidding. I have a friend who deconstructed from Mormonism, and she used that terminology to me recently. Like, we were just in a casual conversation. She's like, I was part of the true church. I swear to God, the wind almost got knocked out of me. And I was like, immediately, that terminology is just I don't know how to explain to you, the fact that you use that terminology and I use that terminology. And it's this humbling moment of when you deconstruct that, there's so many faith systems that one of the ways they're locking you in is they're basically just saying, we're right, everyone else is wrong. You want to be on the side of heaven that we're on, and everybody else is kind of just going to have to figure it out, right? So when you asked what was the moment, it was probably untangling that. I was like, dude, there's no way that I can digest this bullshit anymore. That I'm sitting there and I'm like, this is the only path to righteousness or piety or connection to the spiritual hierarchy, right? And so I know that sounds complex. I wish I had an aha moment. I would say the closest thing I had to that aha moment was that moment in that group. And then also I was in church probably maybe a year or two later. I was inside of Mass, which is, just our church service. Mm. And oh my gosh, this is what I talk to people. I go, listen, this book, I talk about your inner wisdom a lot. I talk about your inner sacred wisdom, the wisdom that you have inside of you. That's what I meant by the breadcrumbs. There is a part of your psyche that is still there, that is probably desperately trying to be amplified, right? And this is probably a memorable moment that I would say is a shift. Is I was sitting in the pew-ish area. I was with my kids, and I had almost an out-of-body experience. I don't know how to explain it other than that. And I'm getting chills right now because there was this out-of-body experience that previous me would have said it was God, right? I would be like, this is God, God's speaking to you, right? But once I started untangling, it was this voice, and it was gentle. It wasn't mean. It was just, you don't belong here. And it was the most tangible voice. I don't know how to describe it other than it was a tangible resonance. And once I knew that that did align with me, it wasn't you don't belong with me or you don't belong here. And I was like, no, I do. I wasn't fighting the voice. I was like, you know what? It's time to listen. That's what it was. It was, I think it's time to listen to that inherent wisdom. I could tear up right now because I have goosebumps all over me. But truly, there is an inherent wisdom. And when I tell you the sadness that my faith told me that inherent wisdom is demonic. So I had
Right.
to spend time in my psyche deconstructing that voice wasn't the voice of Satan. It wasn't the voice of his demonic angels. It was genuinely me attempting to save myself, which honestly, I look back and it's a beautiful thing. But going through that was so difficult. It was so much suffering because I remember feeling like constantly I'd wake up and I'd be like, okay, I know that I don't feel like, but then what if I'm getting attacked? What if someone's cursing? Like, what if someone put their demons on me? Or what if I'm believing the demonic presence of blah, 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 right? And so remember the context of my OCD, my brain was basically needing it to be one or the other. And it was a lot of pain when it wasn't any of those. It was very gray. And I was like, okay, so this is super gray. This is super unsettled. And then I started turning to my friends who kept talking about the wilderness. And I love this language. This is one of my favorite ways to describe untangling from these ideologies. Is if I'm going to give you a parallel with toxic relationships, I try to explain to people there is a period when you untangle yourself from that control that happens in these relationships. And you have to enter into the wilderness. And that is one of the scariest places to be. Why? Because our brain wants things settled. It wants familiarity. It wants one thing or another. And wilderness says, we're figuring it out. We don't have that settling place for us right now. And I know you want it. And I know you want to run to that next church. And I know you want to run to that next relationship. And I know you want to run to that next solution. But right now, we have to be in the wilderness. And that's how I would describe what it felt like untangling from this faith system, where I remember starting to talk to my peers and they're like, we know there's no right answer right now for you, but all I can tell you is I'm going to stand with you in the wilderness. And I could cry right now. Like, people who are willing to stand with each other while victims, survivors, however we want to talk about that language, while they are finding themselves, that is one of the most beautiful things you could ever do to someone. Because if you think about someone with CPTSD, which is one of the things that I identify with, I tell people with CPTSD, they don't know much of a before, right? The only before I had was my dad, who also had OCD, was maniacally fasting and it was like rigid. It was like, I have to do this to be whole. And I was like, I have to do XYZ to get into heaven. Then I got deeper into this cultist mentality. And people are asking me like, what do you want? Well, what do you think you believe? And who do you think you are? And I go, I don't know how to answer that because I don't know if I ever got to figure that out. And I'm being serious. Like, I've talked to my friends who got out too. And I go, I don't know if I had much of a before. Because if you think about how young I was, 13, 14, 15, I was just on the horizon of building my personality, right? I was fully trying to evolve myself into who I was. And then I went into this cultish mentality. And then I got out when I was like close to 30. I'm closer to 40 now. And I sit there and I go, how do I answer that question? How do I answer who I am?
It seems like, too, that the apparatus that helps you discern who you are was made demonic.
Yes, thank you.
So you have to kind of establish a relationship with the thing that is the discerning apparatus as not bad. And actually your rudder in a lot of ways. If I'm hearing you correctly, it just kind of feels like you have this voice that's like going, that's not good, and that you're being told that's demonic when it's actually the thing that's supposed to guide you.
Like a dagger.
And that's also super consistent with like pretty much everything we've looked at so far, don't you think, Nip? Like the Mormons say, doubt your doubts. For us, it was like that feeling you have is just they didn't say Satan, obviously, but it was like, that's just a disintegration. It's something that we're not integrated with. And the example, I'm sure I've talked about this in the podcast before, they'd say like, sometimes if you're driving a car and a light comes on that indicates that like the fuel is low or something needs to be checked, if something's wrong, sometimes that's true, but sometimes the light's broken. So basically getting you to question of like, you're questioning something and you're going, yeah, well, maybe it could be that something's wrong or the light's broken.
And at a certain point, you have to, particularly in Sarah and I's journey, you have to consider that every one of these structures, hierarchies, whatever you want to call them, has a very keen understanding of the apparatus that is going to inspire their attrition. And making sure that you don't listen to it from an early age is in their best interest in keeping you coerced. And so that's just one of the things. And that goes for any extreme, whether it be, whatever your beliefs are. People are keen onto what's going to get their thesis or their premise doubted. And they have things ready to gaslight you or prevent you from doing that. It sounds in your case, it was just your conscience or whatever the words are. I mean, you can rotate whatever words you want to use for it, but that seems to be the process with all of them.
That's why I said it felt like a dagger. When I hear the way you described it, that's why I would describe that feeling as like a piercing of my inherent wisdom and then embedding inside of me this deep self-doubt. And like you said, Sarah, doubt that the engine light is working, doubt that your inherent wisdom works, doubt that the thing is functioning correctly. And I sit there and I go, that's why when I step back and people are like, you know what, Jamie, I don't know. I go to church and I don't think it's a cult. And I sit there and I go, listen, our experiences are a spectrum. There are certain people that are part of the faith right now, either a Christian faith or Jewish or Muslim or whatever faith system. And they actually do not have what I just described. They don't have this like binding, tethered, coercive, manipulative mindset that got pushed into them. And they just look at it as, I just go to church and I just go to synagogue and I'm chill. Like I'm fine. Right. And I go, I'm glad that you haven't experienced that level. And I will say that to whoever's listening, who's like, no, I don't have that experience, Jamie, and I cannot relate. And I go, I am so grateful you can. I'm being serious. I am so grateful that you cannot relate to me.
Yeah.
Please, please never find yourself in a way that you're because what I try to explain to people is that it is a spectrum. And that's why it's so easily missed for so many people, because I know that there's a variation of my faith out there that doesn't have any of this in there. It's just, I mean, it might have some of the like, inherent properties of like, hey, we kind of have to like tout this ideology, but it's not like full immersion into this like collective system where you're having to be accountable. And that was one of those things where I try to explain to people like my version that I experienced taught me to be codependent. And I'm not joking you, like full codependency. You are not your own. You are your brother or sister's keeper. Everything that they're going on is going on inside of you. If they sin, you sin. You are basically no better than them if they're sinning and you don't call them out. You must bring them to full accountability. And it was always about like touted as accountability, but really what it was incredibly coercive codependency. And so my brain was like, oh my God, wait, are my sisters sinning? I gotta like go help them. And that's where that enmeshment and like me and Sarah talked about this briefly, but like the enmeshment and the blurred boundaries where you don't know where you begin and they end. You just know that like they're sinning and you got to go find out like how to get them to a priest or how to get them to their salvation. Right. And so when I was taught that inside of this microscopic circle, which, household, university, the whole system, when I was taught that in various coercive circles, of course I believed it. Of course I believed that when you told me that if I don't talk to my sister when she is faltering, that I'm now part of the problem. You are inherently saying by omission that you approve of her behavior by not going to her and telling her that she is externally sinning and we all can see her sinning. And by the way, what is sinning? In this case, I'll give you an example. When someone would wear like a spaghetti strap, if I wasn't calling them out on that behavior, I was part of the problem. I might as well wear a spaghetti strap or like a scandalous top.
Jezebel.
Exactly. I might as well be a part of the problem.
And now a brief message from our Little Bit Culty sponsors.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Break time's over, people. Let's get back to this episode of A Little Bit Culty. It's a good one.
This is the thing that really rocked me the most with your book, which we're going to dive into in part 2. But like the term enmeshment, the term codependent, super familiar with those terms. I hadn't fully put it together that the cult, whether it's the cult leader or the leadership or the community, is the toxic partner, right? And that the codependency is not just with like your mother or your spouse or your child, it's with a group. Can you talk about that?
Ooh, you hit the nail on the head. I actually am so grateful that you outlined that. And it's been a talking point that is starting. I really hope it's coming out into the culture more, because let's be a part of it, right? Let's do it right now. Let's bring it out into the culture, because my subspecialty is people with narcissism, like they're recovering from a narcissistic dynamic or a power and control, whatever it is. And I was working, and one of my clients pointed out, like, do you not see the parallel about cult survivors and narcissistic abusive survivors? And I go, I think my psyche was probably protecting me a lot from that. And of course, because the parallels of like someone who survived a cult and someone who survived a toxic system, parent, family, religion, whatever, right? Oh my gosh. The parallels are what they're literally, if it's a Venn diagram, it's a circle, right? It's like they're so overlapping that it's so profound to like start looking at people who are in toxic family systems or toxic partnerships. And when you can understand that it's basically a microscopic cult, it's really interesting to understand that ideology and that framework, right? Because you're like, okay, well, how can one person be a cult leader to, their group of friends? And I go, have you met someone who has some of these tendencies? And yes, of course, their tendencies are rooted in trauma. I will absolutely be that first person to tell you, I'm not going to throw them under the bus. People who have narcissistic tendencies are clearly experiencing an extensive amount of trauma, and they've been able to process it through this lens, which is a very harmful lens, right? But when you go into why do we see similar themes in cult leaders? Why do we see what we collectively understand in the political landscape, or when we collectively understand what's happened in some of the blockbuster cults that we've seen people talk about for, decades? There's a reason, because if you operate these mechanisms, power and control, blame shifting, love bombing, when you understand, like if you really look into love bombing, they basically have been studying that from cults. That's what's so interesting when you go into the research. I was like, wow, I didn't realize that love bombing originated when they were identifying groupthink and what the groups would do to the beginning, to the newcomers, right? The newcomers of the cult. Like if you're new.
A new recruit.
Yeah, the new recruit, right? Yeah, like, or the new, what do we call it in religion? Like the
lambs.
Yes, the lambs, the people that are like the possible converts or whatever. Basically, when you look at the new recruits, there's a very specific psychological strategy that's happening. And when I look back at what happened with me, and this is why I go, how do I understand? Like when I try to understand, okay, I clearly was part of a toxic relationship. That relationship just has to happen to be an institution, right? I realized what happened with me is it was love bombing at that camp, right? It was 72 hours straight of love and enrichment and deep conversations and music and food and camaraderie and community like I never have felt before. Remember, I was an early teenager. So I was like, people get along and people are like happy and they're all like believers of God. And I didn't realize that people are like this. So that happened over the course of years for me. And slowly I was like, yeah, this works. Like, yes, this is real. God works this way and God is working through this university and this institution, right? And then, of course, the deeper I got in, the more I was fighting back for everybody's put back, or like they were like, oh, that doesn't sound right. No, God doesn't hate this group of people, or no, God isn't like that. And I would be the defender. I would be the flying monkey, like Nippy said. Like I was like, no, literally I was the defender. And I tell people this, if you knew me like 10-ish years ago, which is weird because it feels like a lifetime ago, but 10 years isn't that long. 10 years ago, I was what I would be considered the golden child of my faith. I was, doing all the right things with my kids. I was doing all the right doctrines. I was following to the T what Catholics needed to do. I wasn't allowed to do this. I wasn't allowed to do that. If there was a fast day, I needed to fast. If there was a holy day, I needed to go to it. Like there were all of these like inherent ways that you could prove that you were holy, and I wouldn't miss one of them. I was like, if there's one opportunity for me to prove that I'm holy, I'm going to go to it. Right. And so I was a perfect example of like how something that is a toxic ideology that gets extreme can turn the believer or the recruit fully into the flying monkey that will go to bat for them. And like, and I remember when I was an early adult, me and my friend we both deconstructed, we both thought we were going to die for the faith. I don't know how we thought we were going to die for the faith, but that's how extreme we got. We were literally, and I'm not kidding, I remember these conversations. We were being like, well, would you actually die for the faith? And I was like, yeah, I'd die for the faith. Like I would die for what this is. And that's how I knew how deep it was. I was like, wow, I would give up everything to commit myself to this ideology.
Question, when you had these wake ups and you had this out of body experience, did you just peace out or how did you extract yourself? Did you leave? How's your family been with this?
So like I said, I was the golden child, mainly because I have a family of 7 siblings and my family has a lot of trauma. And if any of my family are listening, this is not news to them. We have a lot of trauma. We have a lot of loss. And my parents, I'm a pastor's daughter, so to say. My dad is in the higher hierarchy of the church. He's the married version of a priest, which is called a deacon. And my dad, I'm like a preacher's daughter, right? Like he's part of the faith. He's a leader of our church. He is. No longer my church, but his church. So all of us, this was like a culture, right? My faith was a culture and a faith system, right? So I was raised as like, if I'm Catholic, I'm like the most, I guess, evolved version of what my parents wanted me to be, right? And when I say my dad, it's my stepdad for people who are confused. Who's like, didn't your dad die? Okay, he's my stepdad. He raised me after my dad died. So he is an essential part of my life. And when I tell you untangling from this faith system, I knew I had to shake every perception that everyone had of me. Because remember, I was the golden child. I was the most religious version of the siblings. All my siblings like failed in regards to that. I was like the most pious. So I was on the highest pedestal basically, right? And it got so bad that I never forget this. My mom looked at me and she goes, Jamie, I remember this because I was talking to her about, I think, fasting. We just cried. We were just crying on the phone together because she knew I was changing my entire life. And I remember her talking about her God, like I was her daughter's godmother. She was like, you're not going to be a part of the faith like she was just grieving openly, right? And this is like blood and water kind of thing. Like she's still to this day one of my closest person. And for about 1.5 years, she wasn't part of that, right? So this was an intense period of like suffering and grief and wilderness. And for people who are starting to untangle themselves from some of these toxic systems, that is a very hard pill to swallow. I try to explain this to people. I go, listen, it's very difficult to know that you have to enter into this level of pain to process what you just went through. And so I know we're going to kind of go into part 2, but that's where I would leave us, which is to get to the point of healing we need to get to, we have to have a period of space and time and exploration. And that exploration can be lonely and it can be painful.
Especially if there is codependence.
Exactly.
Yes, I hear you. As somebody who felt the pain of losing my community overnight, I totally understand. And I'm so glad that you got out. I'm so glad you had the space to figure it out. And I want to thank you for sharing your story. And I can't wait to have you back next time, which will probably be dropping on the feed in a couple days, to hear about how you got the clarity to write your book, Toxic Relationship Recovery, which also could be cult recovery. And we'll talk about all the correlations and have some laughs, hopefully along the way amidst the pain.
Yes. Thank you for having me.
We'll see you soon. Bye for now. You like what you hear? Please do give us a rating, a review, and subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen. Every little bit helps us get this cult awareness content out there. Smash that subscribe button. You know what to do. That's the end of part 1. Join us in a few days for part 2.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean. I'm hanging on to the weight of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We're heading over to patreon.com/a-little-bit-culty now to discuss this episode. In the meantime, dear listener, please remember, this podcast is solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. It's not intended as a substitute for real medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. For cult recovery resources and to learn more about seeking safely in this culty world, check out a-little-bit-culty.com/culty resources, and don't miss Sarah's TED Talk called How Cult Literate Are You? Great stuff.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production, executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames, in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound and our co-creator and show chaplain/bodyguard, Jess Temple Tardy. Our show writer is Holly Zadra, and our theme song, Cultivated, is by John Bryant.